Okay, now that you have a structure to help you navigate your conflicts a little bit better, now's the time to help you get used to the routes that you want to take and to also know how to avoid the ones that'll end up badly for you. Now, to do this though, I want you to imagine being at a fork in the road, at a point where the road splits into two different directions. Now, one way takes you down that destructive loop that we talked about in the last section, the one where you just cycle over and over again, causing real damage to your marriage over time. But the other way takes you in a different direction, one that'll help you get closer to healing and resolution in your relationship. Well, you keep that imagery in your mind. What I'm going to do here is describe to you what happens when you go down each of these paths so that you can tell more easily when you're on the right track and when you're on the wrong one. And the reason why this is so important is because not only will it help you to know how to make the right decisions when that time comes up in conflicts, but it'll also help you to set your expectations more realistically, even when you start to do things better. I'll explain how that works in a little bit. Okay, let's start off by describing when you go down that bad path for fighting. Remember, this is a loop, so they cycle back over and over again, but instead of just thinking of it as going in circles, think of it like spiraling downward, getting worse and worse the deeper and the longer that you go into those cycles. All right, the first point of the cycle is what starts any conflict, and that's going to be the trigger. This is the point where your spouse does or says something that'll hurt or offend you enough to where you have some feelings about it. Now, I want you to think of this like being right there at that fork in the road. You've got a key decision to make here. If you regulate and can be resilient, you can choose the right exit that'll take you on that road to healing and resolution. But let's assume that none of that happens. No regulating, no resiliency, and you start going down that bad fighting loop. Now, the next mile marker, once you've chosen poorly, is the flood point. If you recall from chapter 1, this is where your lower brain takes over and you become emotionally flooded, when you're no longer able to think and to remain composed. At this point, anything that happens after you hit flood point are likely things that you're probably going to end up regretting. It's really hard to recover once you hit the flood point because of how powerful your emotions can be in that moment of conflict. So, not that it's impossible to pull out of that loop and reset, but just that it's a lot harder to do once you're in that emotionally flooded state. Now, the next mile marker is what I would call a distracted or unfocused response. This is when couples get sucked into debating over surface level stuff. Things like the trigger for a conflict, which could be anything like taking out trash or scheduling issues with the kids. But really, even though the trigger is what starts a conflict, it's actually just a distraction from the core underlying issues. The one common characteristic I would say about this stage of the bad fighting loop is that couples speak and act before they have time to really think through what the conflict is actually about, and they get stuck at that trigger level for the conflict. Okay, after this, the next stop are those bad fighting habits. This is all the stuff that we covered in chapter 2. Spewing, stuffing, leaking, blaming, invalidating, all those destructive bad habits that feel natural and satisfying in the moment, but are absolutely terrible for your marriage. At this point, plenty of things are said and done that actually lead to triggers for new conflicts. In a sense, the initial conflict acts like a seed or a virus, spreading and multiplying into multiple other triggers for new conflicts, which leads to the next mile marker in this loop and actually brings us back full circle to more triggers. And at this point, it all starts all over again, spiraling further and further down. A couple can loop through this cycle over and over again until they just get worn out and tired of fighting, but not until a lot of things have been said that can't be unsaid and a lot of damage has been done as well. So that's the bad fighting loop. Trigger to flooding, to distraction, to bad habits, and back to more triggers all over again. Round and round we go. But if that wasn't bad enough, there's actually another kicker. Something else to note about this loop, and really what makes it so destructive for marriages. The more this goes on, because these issues aren't getting resolved, but actually compounding, more narratives and resentments are also getting built up over time, which means as these painful narratives and resentments build up, the more likely and easier it becomes to trigger more conflicts inadvertently down the line. Remember, narratives act like filters that magnify and distort conflicts. Small triggers that normally wouldn't be an issue eventually become big triggers that can blow up a conflict in just a few short seconds. That's the reason why this loop doesn't just go in circles, it actually spirals downward and can spread like a virus into your marriage, degrading the communication abilities and seeding deeper narratives that will distort and charge more conflicts as months and years go by. Like I said before, This loop is something that's really easy for couples to get stuck on, and once you're stuck in the cycle, it's easy to rack up serious damage and debt in the marriage. Okay, that's a quick description of a bad conflict cycle. What typically happens if you make a wrong turn at that fork in the road. Now, what I'm going to do next is introduce what happens if you choose the healthier route. But before I describe how this route works, there's one thing I need to explain to you first. And I'm sorry to burst your bubble here, but this healthier route is also going to look and feel a lot like a loop as well. I'm telling you that now so you're not surprised and so you don't get super bummed out or frustrated when it feels like you're still going around in circles. If you're doing it right, you're probably going to have to cycle through your conflicts for a while, but you get better at how you communicate in conflict. But the key difference here between a healthy versus an unhealthy fighting loop is that a healthy fighting loop cycles upward and in the opposite direction. If you follow the steps, eventually you'll begin to elevate your conflicts and start seeing things much more clearly. But at first, maybe for some time, you'll have to go through each mile marker over and over again until you get better at hacking through into your conflicts. Okay, now that your expectations are set a little bit more realistically here, let's start back at the beginning of that fork in the road, the trigger for the conflict where you've got some critical decisions to make. All right, once you pass that trigger point, the decision that'll enable you to make the right turn is the usage of those emotional regulation and resiliency muscles. Literally, have it in your mind that turning that steering wheel hard into the other direction is going to take using all your emotional regulation and resiliency muscles to do it. Remember, the better you are at being able to regulate your emotions once you're triggered, and the more resilient you can be with your feelings of uncomfortable emotions, the wider that you can expand that conflict window before you hit the flood point, which means the further you can go down that healthier path for conflict. Okay, once you make it to emotional regulating and resiliency, the next mile marker that we're looking for in this route is focus, processing, and planning. This is where you process and figure out what your issue in the conflict is going to be about. This is where you figure out your BTF, who's pitching and catching, what tier and lane that you're going to use. This is where you set up all the essential parts of your conflict and plan where you're going to go so that you don't get lost and distracted along the way. Now again, this takes a lot of practice to do quickly in the moment of a potentially heated conflict. That's why proactive conflicts can be really helpful. Proactive approaches to conflict essentially starts a conflict at this point. They remove the intensity and the time crunch of that trigger and the need to manage that flood window. Now, when you start a proactive conflict, you start having your processing and planning already, taking all the time that you need to process, plan, and structure all the key parts of your conflict before you engage. But the hope here is that eventually you'll be able to do all those things much more quickly and on the fly in the middle of a reactive conflict when you have to adjust for the trigger and the flood point in the conflict. Just be patient with yourself and your spouse. It'll take time to build up to that. Remember, think of it like driving 70 miles an hour on the highway where you have just a few short seconds to decide which way you're going to go when that road splits into multiple directions. The more experienced you are as a driver and the more familiar you are with the highway, the faster and easier it'll be to make quicker decisions in a reactive conflict situation. Okay, your next mile marker is engage and communicate. And this is where you actually start the process of pitching or catching the conflict. Remember, at this point, it should be clear who you want to be the pitcher and the catcher, what tier and lane in the conflict that you're using. All that you're doing here at this point in the conflict is communicating what you've processed and come up with. At this point, all those rules for fair fighting are super critical. One pitch or issue at a time, one pitcher at a time, one lane or objective at a time. The more you add or change, the more likely you'll find yourself back on that bad conflict loop again. Now, the next mile marker is what I call discovery and digging for new information. Now, you might think that once you engage, the next step should be finding resolution to your conflict, but realistically, it's not. This next step builds in the likely possibility that you'll discover more about yourself and your spouse as you talk through and dig into the conflict. And you know what? That's a good thing. Conflicts are rarely, if ever, about the first thing that you think of. And more often than not, if you're doing it right, you'll learn that the conflict is actually about something deeper and more meaningful. And if that happens, that's great. That's exactly what we're hoping for in conflict. The discovery process means that you're learning more and getting to the root of what actually needs to be resolved. And you're getting to know yourself and your spouse better as a result as well. Now here's the thing. Once you've gone through this mile marker, it's likely that you'll have to start over again and loop back through all those things again. Once you discover new information, that might feel like a new trigger that could spark having to go through the whole cycle again. That's why I'm saying this healthier method of fighting is going to feel like a loop as well. But remember, try not to feel discouraged. Instead of that loop spiraling downward, causing more destruction, this loop is actually cycling upward, leading you closer and closer to connection and resolution and healing. It's just every time that you uncover and discover something new, you might have to redo everything in that loop, regulate and process all the new information that you discover, reset the pitch, the lanes and tiers, all that stuff all over again. So for particularly deep-seated conflicts, things that might feel like deeply embedded narratives or pain points in the marriage, it's likely that you'll need to cycle a number of times before you start getting closer to resolution. But eventually, if you repeat the cycle enough times and get down to the core of the conflict, you'll actually stop the loop and can reach that last and final destination of reconciliation and resolution. So that's the healthy conflict loop. Both healthy and unhealthy loops will cycle over and over again, but one spirals into a destructive tailspin, while the other one elevates your understanding of what the issues are. One eventually dead ends into a buildup of narratives and resentment. The other one leads to healthy connection, healing, and resolution. Remember, think of this like having to constantly make decisions at a fork in the road. Choosing the right and healthier path takes time and repetitions. Just like a path that's never been walked, it might take multiple efforts to begin paving that pathway so that it'll feel easier to do in the long run. And as well, making quick reads and decisions on where to go and how to proceed in these reactive conflicts where there's a trigger point takes time and repetitions too. But the more you do it, the easier and more natural it'll become. Okay, that's it for this section that mapped out for you bad conflict loops and healthy conflict loops. In the next section, in the final one for this chapter, I'll give you much more specific directions on how to use key protocols to make sure that you can keep your conflicts safe and constructive.